We are launching a new series this week, and we're calling it Anchored. And the idea is that there are times in our lives when we will go through storms, when the boat is really going to be rocking, and that is when we need to, above all, get anchored in Jesus. And I'm sorry about my voice this week. I've just kind of been coughing with allergies and a little cold this week. But anyway, this is our series on Anchored. And there's two stories in the Gospels that talk about the disciples in this storm with Jesus. And there's another one in the book of Acts. And we're going to look at all of those stories of Jesus being with us in this storm. And that's the message that I really hope we can hear in these next couple of weeks, that Jesus is with us in the storm. And I really want to dive into what that means for Jesus to be with us and how we can anchor our lives more deeply and surely in Him. Because when the seas get rough, and the waves grow tall and the winds tear the sky apart, that is when we want to turn and we want to place our faith in Jesus. Now, I don't know about you. I don't know what your experience has been, because I have never been in a storm at sea. And honestly, I don't want to be. That is not on my bucket list. I have been in plenty of storms. I'm guessing you have too. But, from my house, from my car. I guess the closest thing I've ever got to being in a storm that kind of reminds me of the story of the disciples is one time I was flying on this long flight, and the planes on airlines, the wings on the airline, they bend. They're meant to flex if you really get into high winds. And I remember one time I was on this long flight, and this storm picked up, and this plane really starts to buck, and I happened to be kind of seated where I could see the wings, and I'm looking out, and in between the lightning flashes, I'm seeing them do this. And it's one of those things where you're like, well, I kind of know they're designed to do that, and I'm glad they're doing that rather than breaking off, but I would really not see the wings be flapping right now, you know what I mean? You're hanging on. That was about the closest I've ever been, but I have never been out at sea in a storm. I don't know if you ever have. It's just one of those things that it's kind of hard to experience. The disciples would have been out there exposed to the elements, the wind hitting them and the rain hitting them, the spray from the sea, and their boat rocking and going up and down. And, I've never been in something like that, but I have experienced storms in my life. And I'm guessing you have too. Back when I was ordained for ministry 13 years ago, the conference minister, I remember this because it became something more important to me than I ever imagined it would be, but the conference minister read the words of Isaiah 43 over me. And those words say this: "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. And when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. And when you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." And those words have proven true in my life more times than I can count or probably even remember. And I found myself passing through the water, and I have touched the flames. And the Lord God has been with me and has protected me. And my guess is that you've had those experiences too, because if you live long enough, you will experience a storm. Life happens. Live with a little daring. Go beyond where everybody else is going in the crowd. And my guess is that you will run into a storm, because if you take a risk, there is a good chance that you're going to start getting out onto the deep water where the waves start to roll, and that's where the storms are. If you try something big, you're probably going to feel the seas start to move. That just kind of goes with the territory. And I've experienced those storms. I bet you have too. Yet at the same time, I always want to be a little bit careful when I talk about storms in life, because sometimes we can talk about as if life is always a storm, right? And if you listen to Christian radio, and it sounds like people are always in storm mode when you hear these songs, right? Like some of the air. I love some of these songs, but I got to be honest, sometimes I can hardly listen to K-Love or something, because every song is so dramatic and it's so emotional. It just feels like these up and downs, and I can hardly do it. Because every song is lost and found and wounded, healed and abandoned, and then in love, and my heart is like a yo-yo, so I can only do a couple of songs. It has to be kind of small doses for me. But we're sort of all like that. We like, in one way, the attraction of the storm. They're kind of exciting. We love the spectacle of the storm. Just think about a real storm, right? When a storm is coming, you turn on the TV, and what do? Right? the weatherman or the weatherwoman, they're always kind of trying to egg it on, like, stay tuned. Potential bad weather coming your way. You'll want to know about this bad weather. Don't miss it, right? It's very, very exciting. And we kind of go outside and we look at the sky and it's like, ooh, a storm's brewing. It's, there's that little shiver of excitement that goes down your spine. It's harmless, right, in one way. But when we do it with our lives, sometimes we can kind of think that, like, going into the storm is what makes life exciting, and we're always, like, drowning or struggling to go summit the mountain or overwhelmed in the battle. And part of it's because we love these stories of, like, people who overcome, right? Those are exciting stories, people who find God's grace. And maybe we don't admit it, but sometimes I wonder if that life of long obedience in the same direction almost sounds like it lacks drama, and we want some excitement. And what's even more troubling, though, is the way that certain forces out in the world want to make us think that everything is a storm, right? That we are surrounded by storms, that the whole world is about to crumble. And look, I mean, there's some scary stuff, right? But there are also forces that want to unsettle us, because when we're unsettled, when we're afraid, and when we get afraid, we can be mobilized to take action. It's like vote, or send money, or hate this person, or love this person, or purchase this product, right? I mean, there's forces out there that want to do it. I mean, sometimes it's just comical. The one I always think about is, the advertisements that you'll see for air duct cleaning, right? Like this is sort of harmless, but you see these pictures of before and after for cleaning your air ducts, and the ones before, I mean, like, yeah, sometimes you got to clean your air ducts, but the ones before are like, paper cups and these mountains of lint and like bugs and whatever, like down in your air ducts, and you see that and you're like, okay, I really got to get the air duct cleaner in here. But they're trying to scare you, right, to get you to do something. But here's the thing. Even though the world is a little bit crazy, I mean, it's not that crazy. I mean, even though there's issues going on that totally concern all of us, the West Coast is on fire, and the Gulf Coast and the East Coast just got hit with a hurricane. And we see things like refugees so desperate to get out of Afghanistan that they're willing to cling to the outside of a moving airplane. I mean, you see stuff like that. And you see warfare, you see hunger, you see pandemic. I mean, even with all of that, we got to remember there is also so much good out there. I'm talking about storms, but I just want to remind us there is so much good, right? And just think about that. I'm guessing that this morning you were able to drive into church without any kind of like rival militia stopping your vehicle or something like that. I mean, your retirement account and your paycheck, they weren't made worthless before you could spend them because of hyperinflation. My wife's family lived through that at one point in her country. You'd get the paycheck and you'd run to spend it before it was worthless. My guess is you turned on the faucet and clean water came out. There was food in the grocery store. And so we can get fixated on the things that are wrong in the world, but sometimes, this is my little warning, sometimes we can get so focused on the storm that we don't see the good that's right in front of us. And that's something we want to be cautious of too. But look, there are storms, right? Not everything's a storm. If everything is a storm, then we got to ask some questions like, what am I doing, right? Am I living in such a way that I got to change course if everything is a storm? But there are storms, right? There are moments when life seems to be smooth sailing, and then suddenly everything changes, and the horizon bubbles up with dark clouds, and lightning cracks the sky, and the waters toss you. I mean, there are storms. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. There's moments when a disagreement parts an old friendship, or a marriage crumbles, or sickness comes up to your house uninvited, or you lose your job, those are storms, right? Those are moments when the whole world feels like it's caving in on you, and those are moments when we especially need to anchor ourselves in Jesus. And so we're going to be talking about storms for 3 weeks, and I want to look at this passage today. It's from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. If you want to follow along, there's a Red Pew Bible you can do it in. It's on page 990. It's on page 994. But it's this story of a storm. Now, if you look at this passage, we're in chapter 4, all of chapter 3, it talks about Jesus healing and teaching. And in fact, if you go back to 3:9, this is all the preface to that storm. In 3:9, Jesus told his disciples, his closest students, he said, have this little boat ready for me right offshore because this crowd is coming and I'm going to be teaching them and healing them. And if I need to, I got to make a quick exit, get into the boat so I can teach from there, because people were like mobbing him, right? So just imagine that. I mean, here's someone who speaks a word, and that word just lands on your heart. You know it's true. You want more of that. Here's someone who's able to touch the wounded parts of your life, body, soul, mind, spirit, and heal them. And so people are just mobbing him. And he says, I got to have my boat out here in case I need to make an exit. And we're told that at the beginning of our passage, you kind of wonder, it might be the same thing. We're told at the beginning of our passage, verse 36, at verse 36, it says the disciples take him just as he was in the boat. And that's kind of a strange statement. It could be that statement is saying, could be translated, just like last time, right? Just like he was that last time. So in other words, they were piling in on him and they had to get him into the boat, kind of get him out to sea a little bit. So just like last time, the crowd is coming, they had to get him into the boat. And the crowds are left on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, except that if you look at this, verse 36, they get in the boat. Notice that last sentence there. There were also other boats with him, right? Now, I think Mark has given us a hint at several points in the gospel that Jesus' disciples, the circle of people that are following him, it is bigger than just those 12, right? We think about the 12 disciples. We see that those are his hand-picked apostles, right? These people that he is investing life into. He spends most of his time with them. They are the disciples that follow him most closely. But we know there's this larger circle of disciples who also are following Jesus. So if you look at like 4:10, it says there, when he was alone, the 12, and look at that, the others around him asked him about the parables, right? So there's the 12, but then there are others. And so there's sort of this crowd that's like, there's the big crowd, the people that show up for the word and the miracles. Then there's this larger body of disciples. Then there are the 12, the inner circle. And I kind of imagine those 12 in the boat with Jesus, but then some of that larger body of disciples, they get in other boats. And they're like, well, we're going to follow them across the sea, right? We want to be with them. And then verse 37, right? Those other disciples can't keep up. Verse 36, we see there's other boats. Verse 37 is just one boat. And we read in verse 37, a furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Now notice this, it is disciples who are closest to Jesus who go with him into the heart of the storm. And we're really going to see this again next week when we see this other story of the storm. But it's the ones who are closest who go into the storm. And we can get this idea that if God is with us, nothing bad will ever happen to us, right? And that it will, with Jesus, it's going to be smooth sailing. And it's got its own kind of logic. I mean, it's sort of an attractive idea because you read in the Psalms, they say, if God is with me, who can be against me? But the reality is that often the closer that we get to Jesus, the more that we're going to face certain kind of storms. Now, they won't be the storms of sin, which are usually, those are always the storms where we like sow the whirlwind or sow the wind and weep the whirlwind. And people have to face those sorts of storms all the time. They make their bed, then they have to lie in it. I mean, that's the story of our lives. But these are the storms that come up where the power of the evil one is deployed against the will of God, where the power of the evil one comes up against God's people. And that is a storm that happens precisely because we are close to Jesus. And it often turns out that the more we draw near to him, the more we seek to conform our lives to his life, the more we are also going to find ourselves going against the grain of the evil one and the power of the devil, the injustice that we find in the world, and just kind of the prevailing culture that is often against what God desires for the world, because we stand for something. And the closer we draw to Jesus, the more we stand with him, the more we start to hold different values, the more the world around us takes notice, and we'll start to experience some obstacles, right? The ship of our lives gets pointed directly into the heart of the storm the more that we're following Jesus. And I think that's what happens here. It's Jesus' closest disciples. It's the 12. They're the ones who go with him into the storm. Maybe the other boats, the other disciples, they weren't ready for it. Maybe God kind of spared them, took them around the storm, whatever. It doesn't critique them, but we just know it's the closest disciples who go ramming into the storm head on. And look at that storm. It's verse 37, a furious squall. Now, furious squall, I mean, that is it's kind of unfortunate that the NIV, the version that we're using, it's kind of unfortunate that the NIV translates it furious squall, because I don't know, when I hear furious squall, that doesn't really sound that powerful or dangerous or threatening to me. Furious squall sounds like a baby with a wet diaper, right? Like he had this furious squall at 2 a.m., right? You know. And if you look at just about any other translation, I mean, if you got the King James or whatever, you look at just about any other translation, they say great storm or a great windstorm. And this is important because that word great, there's this repetition that's happening in this passage. Remember, Mark, who wrote this gospel, he's using words very carefully, and there's this repetition of the word great. And so there's a series of things that are huge and powerful and terror-inspiring, and they are all, the word there is always great. The word in Greek is megali, right? It's this form of the word mega, right, that we use in English. So it's megali. I wonder if we can just say that together. Megali, right? It's megali. So furious squall, that doesn't really capture it. This is a megali storm. This is a mega storm. This thing's megali. This is a megali storm, and that's important for two reasons. And one is that this is not just a story about the natural elements. There's a similarity in this story and some of the stories of exorcisms in the Gospels, right? An exorcism is when Jesus directly confronts the power of the evil one, casts out a demon from someone. That's an exorcism. There are words that are kind of the same in the exorcism stories and this story in the power of the wind. So, for example, Jesus rebukes demons at different places. And here, look at that, it says he rebukes the wind and the waves, right? Jesus at various points tells the demons to shut up and be quiet. And here Jesus tells the wind and the waves, quiet, be still. So listen, this is not a regular storm. This is a megali storm. It's kind of a demonic storm. Literally, it is one hell of a storm. And the second reason this word megali is important is because it gets repeated. Like I was kind of saying, this is a megali storm. But then verse 39, if you check this out, verse 39, it says, he got up, rebuked the wind and the waves. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. You don't catch it there again, but that completely calm. I mean, if you've got the King James, you'll see it. It was a great calm. It was a megali calm. So there it is again. And then verse 41, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. You don't see it again in the NIV, but they were terrified. It's the same word as there it's mega fear. They had a mega fear before the power of God that they just saw manifested in Jesus. So there you keep seeing it, right? Megali, megali, mega. It's this theme of greatness. It is this great storm, but then Jesus brings a great power and a great calm, and they have this great fear of the Holy One of Israel, the fear of the Lord. The disciples realized that something greater than they expected, something greater than they knew is happening here in Jesus. And then back to verse 38. Jesus was in the stern, right? The storm picks up. He's in the stern, front part of the boat, sleeping on a cushion. Now, how can this be, right? He's in the boat's rocking up and down, the wind's tearing this thing apart. Jesus is sleeping, right? It says he's sleeping on a cushion. Now, if you feel like this rings a bell for you, like maybe you've heard this story before, you are not wrong. There are echoes of this story with Jesus in the boat and something in the Old Testament. Jonah, the prophet, he gets on a boat. Jonah gets on a boat. He doesn't want to go to Nineveh. He wants to go to Tarshish instead. He goes out onto the Mediterranean in this boat, and the storm picks up. And where's Jonah? He's sleeping. So there's some echoes going on here. But, in Jonah's case, that kind of made more sense because Jonah was out there on the Mediterranean, right? Like that was a big sea-going vessel. That is not what we've got here, right? This is just a little fishing boat. It is not nearly as big as anything that Jonah would have been on. This is just the Sea of Galilee. The other name of the Sea of Galilee is the Lake Gennesaret. So it's just a big lake. Now back in 1986, they discovered a fishing boat from first century Sea of Galilee, and you can kind of see what it's like there, or at least get a sense of the proportions. They're not big boats, right? Their purpose was to go out, fish, come back, right? These are not ocean voyaging ships. They're not trying to cross the Atlantic in these things. They're not even trying to cross the Mediterranean. All they're trying to do is just go out and go back with some fish. And there's really no place to kind of hide out in a storm except for at the front and the back of the boat. There's this little covered area. You can't see it in that picture, but there's a little covered area. You could kind of store something under there. Or if you're really tired after a long day of preaching and healing, you could kind of like crawl in there and lay down on what maybe like was a sandbag that they used for ballast. And that's apparently what Jesus did. He was exhausted. He kind of gets under there and goes to sleep. And that is when the storm hits. There's a picture of the front and the back of the boat. You can kind of see it. Imagine Jesus up under that front part, under that wood. There's not much space there. And the boat starts rocking. And verse 38, he's asleep. So think about the disciples. The boat's going through the middle of the storm, and they're like, where's Jesus? And so they go and I can kind of imagine them like Jesus, don't you care that we are going to die, right? Like yelling underneath the boat. He's sleeping at precisely the moment the storm hits. And there's all these allusions to the other parts of the Bible. It turns out there's some Psalms in the Old Testament that speak about God as the one who is sleeping, right? And just perfect power and perfect peace. Like Psalm 44, rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Right? And so the emphasis is like that he is so confident. He is so filled with power and peace that he can just go right to sleep, just kick off in the middle of a terrible storm. Nothing unsettles him. And at the disciples' cry, Jesus comes awake. He rebukes the storm. He says, quiet. He says, be still. And the wind and the waves obey him. It turns out there were some ancient Jewish texts that said when the Messiah, the Christ, when the Messiah comes, the elements of the earth will obey him. Here it is. Jesus says, quiet. The wind goes quiet. Jesus says, be still, and the waves are still. That storm dissipates like a fog on a sunny morning, and all creation obeys his voice, just as in the beginning, all creation came into being at the sound of God's voice. And verse 40, he said to the disciples, it's all died down, and he says to the disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Right? Where's your faith? Essentially, do you trust me? Right? Do you trust me or not? I mean, look, this is a very human response that the disciples have. I don't blame them. Right there in the middle of the storm, we all do this, and we all talk about faith, and we say we have faith, and maybe we claim faith in Jesus for our salvation, right? Kind of this idea of faith. But the moment the storm hits, and the moment the wind picks up, then we're like, whoa, wait, like, hold on. God, where are you? Why is this happening to me? Have you abandoned me? I mean, those are very natural human responses. That's what the disciples had right here. It's normal to think like that. But those are not the responses of faith in Jesus. You see, faith is tested in the storm. And that means that in a way, faith is really found in the storm. And I think we don't realize what it means to have faith in Jesus, to truly follow him even in and into the hard places when the storm, until that storm hits. And it's only then that we really start to know what the meaning of our faith is. At least that's what I've discovered. It's in the storm that we start to understand faith. A couple of years ago, it felt like a storm in our lives. And, I think you all know this, but that was when my mom was diagnosed with cancer, and she declined very quickly, and we were about to have this this baby, and we had a few things that the doctors were worried about before he was born. And some of that had to do with the fact that my wife is, both of us were over 40. I mean, do you know what they call women who have had pregnancies before, who are expecting and are over 40? Do you know what they call them? They say that there's a technical term. If you're over 40 and you're expecting a baby, they call you an elderly multigravida. So multigravida, that just means that you've had more than one pregnancy, but that first word, over 40, they call you elderly. So here we are, right? Like, we're elderly parents, and we're worried about this little baby. And then, when he was born, there was a few little tough things. But then, shortly after he was born, my mom dies. And then on top of that, this terrible storm. I remember my dad called. He's like, if you're going to come, you got to come now. And I'm like, we've got this little kid. We're trying to figure everything out again. We've been little parents of an infant for a while. And a storm just hit, and we were planning to upgrade our vehicle and hadn't changed the tires. I'm like, I don't think the tires would make it that far. And just sitting there thinking, it was like Murphy's Law. Everything wrong that can happen does. And it all happens at the same time. And then I remember later at the funeral, people were really well-meaning, and they said, well, someday. He said, someday you'll know why. And I don't know, I guess they figured that I was asking the question, why me? But that really wasn't what my mind was doing. My mind didn't go there. I mean, it felt like a category error, right? That question of why, that wasn't really the question for me, at least at that moment. And I know people can process tragedy very differently, but that wasn't the question I was asking. I was very sad. But God's faithfulness through all of that storm was not in doubt. And I kept experiencing God's faithfulness, like his presence in prayer, his presence with us, and through you all, in our church, just supporting us. That was our little storm, right? That was a time where a storm hit our lives, and we said, whoa, just hang on, folks. And I know that you have been there too. I know that you have all had storms in your life, and I know that everybody's storm is going to be unique. And I also know that when we call upon Jesus in the storm, that is the moment where he's going to be saying, do you have the faith? That's when he's not going to be criticizing our faith, but just giving us that opportunity. Are you ready to grow in your faith? That's when we can come to a deep faith, when we say, Jesus, where are you? I need you now. I'm in the middle of a storm. What's that faith look like? Well, look at verse 41. They were terrified. They asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. What's that faith look like? I mean, it's the moment when the disciples have this realization. Something dawns on them. This is no prophet like Jonah. Something greater than Jonah is here. They called him teacher, but this is the moment when they realize he is more than a teacher. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Right? They are right to have that great fear in that moment. It was no longer a fear of the storm. That was a kind of cowardly fear. This was an authentic, legitimate fear. This was fear of the Lord. Because they realized that in that moment, they were in the presence of the mighty one. And they see that if they hadn't seen it before, they see now, this is the Holy One of God. And this is what we're talking about. That's the realization they had of faith. This is what we're talking about when we talk about faith. And this is really the center of the whole series that we're doing over these 3 weeks, because here it is. Faith hinges on the disciples' question, who is this? Faith is not confidence that everything will turn out the way we wish it to. That was certainly not the case when we hit a storm. Faith is not the belief that our wishes will all come true if we just believe hard enough. Get this. Faith is all about who. Who is this? That even the wind and the waves obey him. Who is this? That is the question that Jesus is going to put to his disciples later on. He says, who do you say that I am? That is the question of faith. It's all centered in the character of Jesus. It's faith in the one that the letter to the Hebrews calls the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. I love that word anchor. That's where our series gets its name, because we think about anchors. You know how maybe an anchor works. You drop that anchor. We've got an anchor up here. You drop that anchor down into the depths of the water, and you cannot see the bottom. You don't know what's going on down there, but you trust that the anchor will hold you fast. And that's Jesus, the sure and steadfast anchor of our souls. We are anchoring ourselves not in a word, not so much even in a promise. We are anchoring ourselves in a person. It is all about who. So when we say that we have faith in Jesus to be our anchor in the storm, what we are really saying is that even though we don't have all the answers, and we'll never get all the answers, at least not in this life, even though we don't know all the whys, there is only one who can hold us fast, one whose power is mysterious, one who commands the wind and the waves, and that one is with us in the storm. And so what we say when we have faith in Jesus, what we're saying when we talk about this, we say faith in Jesus in the middle of the storm, is we say that we're having faith in the one whose character has proved good, who is true, who is faithful, who is loving. And we tried a new song today. We sang that song, Oceans. And I don't know if you caught the words to that song, but I really love the second line. It says, "You've never failed, and you won't start now." I love that line. I mean, that is what we are claiming. You've never failed, and you won't start now. We're saying that we don't know where everything is going, but we know we are going there with him and toward him. We're saying that we don't know how everything will work out, but we believe that he is at work. And I don't know what you're facing. I don't know what storm might be rocking your world, or what storm you're still trying to recover from last time. I don't have a quick fix or an easy answer. I don't know what you need to hear. But I know this. It is not about the what. It's about the who. Out there on the middle of the sea, in the heart of the storm, the disciples, they at least got that much. Whatever they may have lacked in faith, whatever ways they may have misunderstood, they knew enough to turn towards Jesus. And when the wind and the waves threatened to sink them, they called out for Jesus to help. They got that right. And sometimes I think it takes that storm to teach us to turn to Jesus again, because there's all sorts of places that we are tempted to go for refuge in the storm. Money or privilege or politics, whatever. Sometimes it takes the storm to remind us that in the end, all those other things are going to prove lacking, and they're going to fall away. And turning to Jesus in the storm, it looks like placing our deepest trust in him. It looks like watching in confidence for the ways that he is present with us and leading us. And that kind of watching, that kind of presence, it leads to peace. And while we might not have the depth of peace that Jesus did, where we can just fall asleep on the boat in the middle of the storm, we will begin to find our rest. And we will begin to have hope. And it can be a surprising, sometimes sideways sort of hope. This hope in God, even though everything seems to be falling apart. It can seem completely contradictory, but I know it to be true. It's the same sort of hope that if you look back in the book of Daniel, in the Old Testament, that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maybe you know that one. 3 guys carted off to Babylon. They were forced to bow down. They were supposed to bow down before King Nebuchadnezzar's giant golden idol, but they said, we're not going to do it. We only worship God. And there's this moment in that story, they just kind of say to the king, they say this, there's a big fire. If you don't bow down, they'll throw you in the fire. And they say, if you throw us in the fire, the God we serve can rescue us. But then they add a few verses later, they go, but even if he doesn't, it won't make a bit of difference. And God was with them in the fire. But I love that, right? I mean, when the waves start to roll and the wind tears at the fabric of our lives, we turn to the one who stands calmly in the middle of the storm and says, quiet, be still, and all things obey his command. We commend ourselves into his hands. We know he will be with us in the storm and with the fire, but even if he doesn't rescue us in the way we might want him to, we still have that faith in him. He's the only one whose life is deep and solid enough to be our soul's true anchor. Amen.